We're going back at least 10 years for this one, but it's something I still think about almost every dang day. It was the holiday season, incredibly cold out, and I was walking down the 40th Street, Lowry Street subway station near Queens Boulevard. I can't remember exactly where I was going at the time. I think I was on my way home from work, but I'm not sure if I actually worked a shift or if I just stopped by to pick up in advance, but either way, I'm basically in a world of my own, mulling over my financial troubles as I push through the ticket barrier and find a place to sit. Then, some person gets my attention, but only in that New York way where you don't ever look directly at the thing, you just observe it carefully out of your peripheral vision. This young-looking Latina lady, wearing a blue, white, and gray jacket, was pacing up and down the platform and, muttering to herself. It sounds cynical, I know, but when you grow up in NYC, you learn to live with stuff like that. You learn to just shrug it off and say, "It's none of my business," before moving on. But sometimes you don't get to just look away and pretend it isn't happening because that craziness, those damaged people, they make it your business. So like I said, the Hispanic girl is walking up and down, occasionally sitting down and then getting up again all erratically, and all the while, all the other passengers are just pretending like it's not happening. And then we hear the telltale sign of a train coming down the tunnel. So, just like usual, all the people taking it gradually stand up and make their way towards the edge of the platform. I remember seeing this one dude. He was some older-looking guy, and he's just minding his own business, waiting for the train to roll up. Then, out of nowhere, the girl basically runs up behind the guy and shoves him onto the tracks. The sound the crowd made is something that'll definitely stick with me for the rest of my life. You don't forget real terror like that when you hear it. But the messed up thing is, although they were screaming, no one actually did anything to help. I even remember seeing this flashing light and realizing that some dude was literally just standing there, taking pictures of the guy lying on the tracks as the train got louder and louder, and it got closer and closer. And then, as the screams reached this unbearable peak of horror, the train just rolled over the dude. I remember looking around and seeing the girl that had pushed him bolting up the stairs, trying to get as far away from the scene as she could. People were still screaming, only now some were crying while others followed the pusher up the stairs to either chase her or rushing the payphones to call 911. It all happened so fast I realized that all I'd done is just stand there, open-mouthed, just horrified by the whole thing. And for the longest time I kicked myself for not trying to help the guy. But more than one person has informed me that if I had jumped down to try to help the dude, I probably wouldn't be around to write this. I know the pusher was caught, as I followed the story for a while after, but I can't remember if they were charged with murder or just ended up getting locked up in Bellevue or something, because as sure as eggs is eggs, that girl was Ubats. Taking the subway got real stressful for a long time after, but thankfully, a lot of people were just as scared as I was, and I didn't have to suffer through the anxiety of watching people go too near the edge. They made sure not to all their own. Time went by and hysteria about subway pushers kind of faded, but every so often it still happens. In fact, it happened again just last month. Again, it was a woman from Queens that was arrested. Apparently, she never spoke to the guy she pushed, just picked someone at random and almost killed the guy. Hearing about other pushers just brings all that fear right back to me. One minute you're standing there minding your own business, just waiting for the frickin' subway, and the next, there's nothing. Life can end that suddenly, all because some psycho decided you had to die. Some psycho you never met before in your life. The fact that people out there exist, and there are a lot of them, that's the thing that scares me the most in the world, and why I never get up for a train before it comes to a complete stop. Since mid-July of 2021, China's Henan province had been affected by a prolonged period of heavy rainfall. In just 1 hour alone, weather stations in the provincial capital of Zhengzhou observed a maximum rainfall of 20 centimeters. And that might not sound like too much, but consider the fact that just 20 centimeters caused a horrifying 302 deaths. The flooding has affected a whopping 9.3 million people, and with over 800,000 of them requiring emergency evacuation. Naturally, there are hundreds of thousands of tragic and terrifying stories that have come out of Henan in the past few months, but arguably none quite as horrifying as those that emerged from the floods of July 20th. Zhengzhou is located in a semi-arid region far from China's coasts, a place where the annual rainfall averages just 60 centimeters. But on July 20th alone, 67 centimeters of rain was dumped on the city's unsuspecting populace, with the water pooling in low-lying areas and flooding many of the city's streets. Zhengzhou University's chief hydrologist, Hu Kaihong, stated the city's drainage system was built to withstand what's known as a 100-year flood, so named so because they only occurred every 100 years. Zhengzhou's metro system, on the other hand, its subterranean location making it very susceptible to the flooding, was built to withstand a 200-year flood, with its entrances built on raised platforms to negate the effects of the heavy summer rains. Yet, Hu later stated that the Zhengzhou that day was more like a 1,000-year flood, and unbeknownst to the subway system's operators, water had begun to collect in a metro yard in a low-lying area of the city. Around 6 p.m. that evening, commuters traveling to the Zhengzhou subway system were well aware of the heavy rain that had been falling, but had already been assured that the system was essentially flood-proof. Yet when all the system's trains suddenly ground to a halt, most of which did so in the network of tunnels, its passengers began to suspect that the system wasn't as flood-proof as they'd been told. Some believed it was simply a temporary fault on the line, and that the trains would resume service in due course. But after an extended period of time went by, the passengers began to grow concerned. By 6:10 p.m., just over 500 passengers were trapped underground. 500 passengers who noticed that water had begun to pool on the tracks outside their windows. They must have known that the suspension of service was connected to some kind of leak, but none could have expected how dire the situation was about to get, or the horror that would unfold as a result. Slowly but surely, over the course of the next hour or so, the water levels outside the subway trains grew higher and higher. Cell phone videos of the incident illustrate the elevating levels of concern as anxious humming grows into a crescendo of terrified cries when the waterline reaches the windows of the train's sliding doors. By that point, water had begun to leak into the train carriages themselves, and terrified passengers found themselves having to stand on the seats in order to avoid the still rising waters. By the point that it became too hard to breathe in the train carriages, the passengers knew they had to fight for their lives, and they began to break out of the trains and swim for safety. Many described the terror that they felt as they swam harder and faster than ever before, dreading the moment the water line slipped over their heads and only a lungful of oxygen would separate them from a painful death by drowning. We can only imagine their relief as they emerged at the metro system's various stations, wading their way through waist and chest-high waters as the sheer scale of the disaster became evident to them. Elsewhere in the central Chinese city, almost 100 children had to be rescued from a flooded nursery school, with Chinese state media airing footage of them being floated out in plastic tubs given to them by rescue workers. The first affiliated hospital of Zhengzhou also briefly lost power at one point, which naturally made dealing with the flood casualties extremely difficult. However, Chinese authorities were quick to add that power was restored to the hospital within just a few hours, and that the blackout didn't contribute to any of the deaths that day. The floods were such a catastrophe that an entire battalion of the Chinese People's Liberation Army was mobilized after a 20-meter breach emerged from the Luoyang city dam. PLA High Command was apparently told that the dam could collapse at any time, and if it had, it's estimated that the breach would cause tens of thousands of flood-related deaths. Thankfully, the dam held, but for a while, Chinese social media was aflame with horrifying statuses posted by terrified flood victims. "We don't know how to swim. The whole village is about to be washed away," one person wrote, as the ruination of entire families was documented, each in less than 140 characters. Out of the 500 passengers that were trapped underground that evening, it seems a miracle that only 12 people lost their lives. But those are 12 poor souls who still should be with us today. And although we can argue back and forth on the cause of such dramatic rainfall, questions must be asked when the integrity of the city's public transport system fails so spectacularly and with such fatal results. We can only hope that the lessons of the Zhengzhou subway floods will be learned, and in 1,000 years, when the next apocalyptic rainstorm comes around, we'll be much more prepared to deal with it.